I am leaving after finals for summer internships. I really have zero interest in a long-term relationship, but we get along, and if I could just have an orgasm with you, that would be amazing because I'm so stressed out for finals.
That's Natasha Helfer Parker, certified sex therapist, and this is The Shift Show. I promise that quote is going to make sense in context, although it's a pretty great one to pull out as a teaser, I gotta admit. Today we're going to be talking all about sex, which is super exciting and interesting, and I have known Natasha for several years. This is an episode that we recorded fairly early on in our development of The Shift Show, but it's great because it's a conversation that we have about things that generally people are uncomfortable talking about. And so in talking about them, the hope is that we can understand them more, just like any other issue, and that we can feel more comfortable navigating, right? We talk about things like consent, we talk about honesty, shared values, religion, pleasure, all of these sorts of things. She's amazing. I'm just going to get out of the way and let this episode speak for itself. Enjoy the episode.
You're listening to The Shift Show, where we use psychological insight to unravel the craziness of life for you. You growth mindset person, you. Tune in every other Thursday to hear some wacky psychologists demystify what exactly is happening in that weird organ that lives inside your skull. And for this especially delicious podcast experience, we can thank our friends at Shift Psych, the people who deliver a results-driven and innovative approach in therapy land. Throughout the podcast, we'll throw down some serious psych gems, but these are certainly not a replacement for treatment by a psychologist or a psychiatrist. So please seek one out if you need help.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Shift Show. My name is Zach Erickson, and today I'm really excited because I get to interview somebody that I've actually followed for a long time. I don't know if you know this, Natasha. I don't know if we've ever talked about it, but I'm actually really excited. I've been following our guests for a long time, and so today we are talking all about we're earning our intro bumper a little bit today, but I think it's all in. I'm really excited. We're going to be talking about sex today, which is pretty exciting. I'm really excited. So
Super exciting.
Yeah. So joining me today is Natasha Helfer Parker. She is you wrote it down, a licensed marriage and family therapist, and also an ASEC certified sex therapist. And I'm really excited. Natasha, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. That's one of the more fun, intro mental health, I'm all rocking it. That was great. That's super fun. That's energetic.
Yeah.
Exciting.
I love.
Sexy.
I love, exactly right. When we kind of designed sort of what we were going to do at the beginning of the show and all of that, I'm a real big believer in okay, I got to hear the music and I've got to get excited and actually, all these sort of things. So, Natasha, why don't you introduce a little bit more about yourself and kind of your background, where you come from?
Sure. So like you said, I'm a marriage and family therapist. I've been practicing for, over 20 years now. It's hard to believe. And about 6 or 7 years ago now, I started my sex therapy certification process, which, through ASECT, which AASECT is the organization that does the primary certification for sex therapists. There's some other ones out there, but they're not as good. So that's why I like to say ASECT.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's amazing the kind of certificate you can get in the mail and who knows what else, right?
Yeah, or in a weekend.
Yeah.
So this certification took me 2.5 years, almost 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
So just to give people an idea, it felt really almost like a second master's degree. And so I've been, focusing more on sexuality since then. And it's really been interesting as a marriage and family therapist
mm-hmm.
to not always feel like that training was in line with my sex therapy training.
Mm.
So that was super interesting for me. I had to kind of figure out a lot of my own biases, figure out a lot of my own misperceptions.
Yeah.
Coming from, I mean, when I started, I was probably like 15 years as a therapist. I felt fairly experienced, and yet I was learning all kinds of things that I had no idea about. So sex is pretty taboo in general around the culture, and it's also taboo in the professional field. So, doctors don't get a lot of training on sexuality. OBGYNs don't get a lot of training on sexuality unless they really go looking for it.
Which is surprising that I mean, that's their whole job is, that part of the body. So why would
babies and vaginas and
exactly.
all that kind of stuff. So
exactly. So that's crazy. So I have I think I introduced this to you in the pre-show, but I have a clip for listeners at home and everything. I'm a huge nerd, and I don't hide it. I'm not going to hide it. But one of my favorite movies from last year was Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. And there's they play it off for humor, but that movie in particular has a lot of moments where there's both humor and like, oh, that's actually really insightful. So I wanted to play, it's about 40 seconds long, but I wanted to play this clip, and I think it introduces sort of the perspective that we're talking about today a little bit too, and just kind of what you were saying about the how taboo it is. So here we go. Oh, and I guess as a little bit of backup, this is a scene where, if you haven't seen the movie, it turns out that the main character's father is a planet, and in order to travel the stars, he created sort of like this body for himself that he said was accurate. So that's kind of the way to understand this clip.
I created what I imagined biological life to be like, down to the most minute detail.
Did you make a penis?
Dude.
What is wrong with you?
If he's a planet, how could he make a baby with your mother? He would smush her.
I don't need to hear how my parents...
Why? My father would tell the story of impregnating my mother every winter solstice.
That's disgusting.
It was beautiful. You Earthers have hang-ups.
Yes, Drax? I got a penis.
Ha! Thank you.
It's not half bad.
Huh.
I love that. When I first saw the movie, I was like, again, they play it for humor, but at the same time, like, it really is speaking to something about how, it's almost like he came from a very sex positive culture, and just how completely alien it is to him that you couldn't just talk about sex. Like, what's the big deal? It's a beautiful thing. And I loved that for that reason. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
No, you Earthers.
Yeah. Hang-ups, right?
Yeah, several things there. So first of all, just the discomfort with anatomy, just the fact that we're going to name body parts.
Yeah.
The discomfort with parents, right? Or anybody that's related to you having a sexual life.
Yeah. Yeah.
and then just the also the word disgusting. That's a really interesting word, because we have so much shame in our culture when it comes to sexuality. And that idea of disgust, when we're really trying to think of something that's very pleasure oriented and abandon ourselves to, it's kind of hard to do that when you've been raised with all of these terms like gross, disgusting, yucky, gooey, icky.
Yeah. Where do you think that comes from? Like, because I guess my perspective is I kind of like to, when doing this sort of working towards sex positivity, kind of understanding and deconstructing, where does this idea that sex is gross and we can't talk about it and it's taboo, like where does that come from, do you think? Like, why do we Earthers have
there's a lot of history around sexuality, obviously. And there's a lot of going back millennia, there's a lot of issues around control with sexuality, whether it's religions or governments or entities, that are trying to control things like inheritances and hereditary issues, trying to figure out, before DNA testing, it was hard to know whether or not the baby was yours unless you were pretty controlling about it.
Right. Yeah.
But that's not necessarily why it's seen as disgusting. I think that's why it's so taboo and very, rigidly kind of approached by a lot of cultures, not just our own. But as far as the grossness of it, I don't know if some of that just has to do with, how when you think about your first relationship with your genitals, as far as your parents are concerned, it has to do with potty training.
Right. Okay.
And so I don't know if that's part of, some of the narrative, like be clean, don't touch yourself, germs, yuck. I mean, there is something inherently maybe dichotomous, like there's these two polars. On the one hand, we have this amazing, beautiful part of our body. And on the other hand, it is fairly, closely tied to our waste mechanism.
Yeah.
And that's probably
so
just
like
the
from
reality
from
of sexuality.
like
And
just
then
from a
because we
hygiene
don't talk
perspective.
about it, even things that are like, don't necessarily need to be gross at all, like cum or lubrication or, ejaculate, all of these types of words,
Yeah.
people are, I'm not comfortable with that. I've never even, a lot of times people have their first sexual encounters without even realizing that those types of liquids are going to be, those types of fluids are going to be involved. And so it can feel gross or disgusting because they're just so unprepared.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And kind of like just going back a second as well about more of like the taboo with it, of how, up until I think that we take for granted birth control nowadays too, right? And how now more than ever we are like people in general are more free to be able to experience their sexuality without any, or I guess with much more control with regards to reproduction, and sexuality and reproduction are not necessarily as tied as they used to be, if that makes sense. Right. So like, I wonder if that's part of it too.
Yeah, we can control the consequences of sexuality a lot more than before. At the same time, there's just been so much fear-based education on sexuality throughout, again, millennia that we all come from, that it's hard not to get away from those things. I mean, when you think about birth control, that's a fairly new technology. I mean, less than 100 years old, right? And so we're talking about millennia of messages in regards to sexuality.
Right.
And the sexual revolution just happened, in the 70s, with some things like birth control and condoms and things of that nature that weren't really around before. So the landscape is changing dramatically, but in a very short amount of period of time. And so we haven't had a lot of time to evolve into more sexual positive attitudes, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And so like, where do we, I guess one of the things that I'm interested in kind of getting your take on and kind of having conversation about is, for you, like, what is it like? How do we make that shift to a more sex positive? First off, let's maybe understand what is sort of good, healthy sexuality, and what makes for good sex and safe sex and all of those things, right? Like, what to you when you're talking to somebody, what are the kinds of things that you're either educating clients about, or just kind of keep in the back of your head as far as things that are important with regard to sexuality?
Yeah, and that's a really great question that we could probably spend about 5 days talking about. Because it's kind of the question that got me interested in my training to begin with, because I wanted to, when couples came in or individuals coming in and saying, well, this is what I like to do, or these are the problems that we're facing as a couple, a lot of times people were asking for that kind of permission. Like, is this okay that this turns me on? Or is this okay that we do this as a married couple? Or is this okay that I do this as a single person? Right. And so a lot of what we currently see as quote unquote healthy sexuality is really, quite frankly, affected by a moral overlay. And this is even true in the research, and this is even true in the mental health professions. So I'll just give you a quick example. One of my actually very respected mentors, well, not personal mentors, but, as far as professional mentors, is Sue Johnson. She's done some really great work around couples and attachment and emotional connection, et cetera. But she's pretty adamant that the answer to healthy sex means that you have to be attached and in love and, certain aspects. That if you don't have that, you're not having healthy sex or the best type of sex. And what we know about sexuality from the sex field is that really isn't always the case. So that's more of a moral overlay. So if your values have to do with, in order to have good sex, I want to be able to be in love with somebody or have a meaningful relationship with somebody, that's fine. That's your prerogative. But that doesn't mean that applies to every single other person out there. So there are people who are having casual sexual encounters or maybe polysexual encounters, with different types of people. And as long as they're following certain principles, which we can talk about, those tend to be really great, pleasurable, quote unquote, healthy encounters. They don't have to be broken or if you're, oftentimes you get that idea that, if you're having casual sex or if you've got multiple partners, you're obviously, got commitment issues or you're broken or you come from some type of trauma. And the research doesn't really hold up for any of those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And in fact, you can have a lot of people who are actually in really close, committed relationships doing some pretty crummy things to each other.
Yeah.
and not following sexual health principles. And so I don't know if you want me to go into those right now.
I guess just one of the things that I just wanted to kind of reemphasize before we go into those principles is that what I hear you saying is that there are a lot of things that we may think are important to healthy sexuality and sort of good mental health in general and all those sorts of things. And when we kind of stray, from, let's just use premarital sex as an example, right? So, and there's a lot of, if somebody has as a value that premarital sex is not healthy, or it's amoral to do that, or immoral, I guess, right? That they just believe that having sex before marriage is not a good thing to do. And then if they do have sex before marriage and they feel bad about it, there's almost this sort of misassignment of why that feels bad. And it's not because of the premarital sex part or because of anything to do with the sex. It's more about how they are not living in alignment with the values that they hold. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's definitely one great example because that's one of the principles. So let's go through these really fast.
Yeah, let's do it.
Number one principle is consent, which seems fairly basic.
Mm-hmm.
Is everybody on board with what's happening? Although I'll tell you, things get pretty complicated when you've got partners who've been together for a long time and you've got, what we might call duty sex or feeling guilty sex. Mm-hmm. Or things of that nature. So people might, quote unquote, consent, but not in a space where they feel very authentic about that consent. Mm-hmm. That's not something we're really talking about in general.
Yeah.
Then you've got the principle of being non-exploitative, mm-hmm. which again may feel like, oh, well, of course that makes sense. Don't exploit people. Don't be a sex trafficker, et cetera. But I'm telling you again, in many committed marital relationships, there's quite a bit of exploitation. And what I mean by that is I'm going to, in a sense, kind of punish you if I don't get the way that I want. And we do that through a lot of different ways, like pouting and withdrawing and making people feel guilty or nagging. These types of things can feel quite exploitative because if I don't give you what you want, then I'm going to have to pay for it.
Mm-hmm. Almost like you end up having to give, I don't know if like pity sex is the right word, but or like just that arrangement of well, if we don't have it at least this often, then my spouse is going to be upset, right? Or that kind of thing.
And there's a difference between negotiating those things in a healthy way versus using exploitation ways to get what you want.
Yeah.
Unwanted pregnancy and STIs, so protecting from those things, is the third principle. The fourth principle has to do with honesty. So can I be honest about my erotic preferences, what I'd like to get out of this relationship, what I'm looking for in these sexual encounters we're having, what's my take on sexuality, et cetera. Number 5, which is tied to that, is shared values. So do we know what each other's values are? And then the last one would be mutual pleasure. So let me just give you 2 scenarios where, kind of a classic way to blow these things apart as far as some of the myths that we have in general culture. So let's take a couple of college-aged kids. I say kids. That means I'm old when I'm talking about college-age people. Anyway,
Full adults, young adults,
college-age adults who are wanting to have sex.
Yeah.
And let's say that you've got, a couple, let's just say heterosexual couple, and they are friends and they know each other. They're kind of flat, they live on the same floor. And one of them, approaches the other and says, "Hey, it's finals week. I'm totally stressed out. I know we've been kind of flirty, and I would totally, totally be into having some sex with you. I don't know what you think about that. I am leaving after finals for summer internships. I really have zero interest in a long-term relationship, but we get along, and if I could just have an orgasm with you, that would be amazing because I'm so stressed out for finals." And the other person says, "That sounds pretty cool. That is in line with my values. I don't have any issues with that. I can be honest with you too and tell you I'm totally into that, and I'm not going to hold you responsible for a long-term relationship." They go off. They protect against STIs and unwanted pregnancy by using birth control. They're consensual. There's no exploitativeness. They really prioritize each other's pleasure. So there's some oral sex happening and some penis-vagina sex happening until both have an orgasm. They have a great time. They never see each other again. Okay, that's an encounter where they have followed all the sexual principles. And because they're not in conflict with their sexual values, so let's just say this is not maybe a person who comes from a religious background, and so they don't really have any conflict within themselves. There's no guilt. There's, none of that shame or, oh, I shouldn't have done that, or I was drunk to be able to have to do something like that. Or so that it was just very open. Now, a lot of people would be like, what? How can that be a healthy sexual encounter? Okay.
Yeah.
So then let's go to the other extreme, which is a heterosexual married couple. They've been married for 20 years, have several kids together, have only had sex with one another. So they married as virgins when they were quite young. And they have this routine where, the husband, who tends to be, in this relationship is the high libido partner. He comes to bed. He starts stroking her shoulder. She's turned away from him. She starts getting this pit in her stomach because she knows that means that he would like to have sex. And so she just kind of acts like really quiet and tries to pretend that she's asleep. And he continues to kind of rub up against her and starts grinding against her. And she's not even moving one iota. And she still has even more of a pit in her stomach because now he's like getting off on her body without really her consent or her wanting to even do some of the things that he's doing. She finally turns over and just kind of opens up her legs, kind of as a sign that he can go ahead and have sex with her, but she has zero movement. She has her head turned away from him. She's worried that if she doesn't do this, for the next week, he's going to give her the silent treatment like he's done before. She gets zero pleasure out of it. He is feeling like he can get some pleasure out of it, but he's quite distressed that his wife doesn't seem to desire him or want him or find him sexually attractive. So he doesn't really understand what's wrong. So you've got consent issues, you've got exploitation issues, you've got mutual pleasure issues. You're not being honest with one another about how you're feeling. And as far as shared values, it doesn't even fit their values about what they'd like their sexual life to look like. And quite frankly, he's pretty close to, raping or having non-consensual sex with his wife.
If they weren't married, then we'd be very quick to say, like if that wasn't the case and they were just sort of like bunked up together and the same thing happened, And I'll just tell you from my perspective, as you were telling both of these examples, I was kind of in the first example, I'm thinking, oh, but like I kind of have, again, growing up in the culture that we grow up in, kind of having this sort of recognizing my own baggage and bias that is still stored in the back of my head, and but almost like, but they don't love each other. Like I get it, but it also, I still recognize the tinge from the first example, right? That a lot of people would say that. But then, and I think, okay, like maybe that's not how some people would do it. But then the feeling that I got from that second example is just kind of like, ugh, you know, you know what I mean? It the way that you describe that you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and you can understand the social stigmas, right? So as that college couple comes out of the bedroom and people look and kind of understand what happened, there might be some whispers and some some rumors that get started, or some people being called slutty or non-committed, or just all you care about is sex. I mean, so again, a lot of those stigmas. Whereas the second couple can show up at church and everybody's going to think, oh, what a sweet, lovely couple with their kids, and
Yeah.
have zero concerns about their sexuality. So again, the moral overlays are huge. And the other aspect that I really want to add to this is the part of guilt. And you kind of touched on this. So if you're feeling guilty about something, you might think, well, that's because I did something wrong. And sometimes that's true. But a lot of times what it really is that this narrative has taught you to feel guilty about it. So if we tell young women, for example, if you go off to college and you have sex with somebody that you don't love, you're going to be broken, and you're going to give that person a part of you that you'll never get back. I can guarantee you that she'll give a part of herself that she'll never get back.
Yeah.
Not because that really happens, but because that's the narrative and that's the script that she's been given, versus giving, a college age student the script of, be responsible around your sexuality, think about your values, make choices that you feel good about. If you make some choices that you're not sure about or regret, use them as learning opportunities. And regardless of what you end up doing in college, as long as it's consensual and there's no sexual assault, you're going to be fine.
Yeah.
That's a very different narrative to approach sexuality. So again, we approach our own sexual experiences with a lot of the scripts and ways that we've been taught to respond to our sexual experiences.
Yeah. Well, and what I hear you saying too is that a lot of time with a lot of this, it seems like we conflate sexuality with so many other things, right? Like with love, with self-respect, with this sort of this idea of virtue, or whatever you want to call it, right? Like that all of these things are like personal self-worth is all tied into that. And what I hear you saying too is that let's just treat sexuality as sexuality, and let's not get all these other things kind of like I as I'm saying that too, though, I also recognize that they also are interconnected, but like I don't know, like it's very complex in that sense too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I don't want to by any means minimize that people don't, people have the right to their values, so again, another example I could give is the same two college students, and one person approaches the other and says, hey, I'd really love to have some casual sex with you. I know we're good friends, and I'm really turned on by you, and it's a stressful week. And the other person says, well, thanks. That's a super nice compliment.
Yeah.
And yet for me, I just want to tell you that I have found it more meaningful to have relationships sexually with people that I feel some level of attachment and love to.
Mm-hmm.
So even though that's totally, a nice offer, I'm probably going to pass, but thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an honest interchange of values being different. And it doesn't mean that one person is good or one person's bad or one person's open and liberal and worldly and one person is rigid and frigid. And, it just means we have different values and we negotiate our sexuality differently. And we both have a right to do that without having all this overlay that society puts on it.
Yeah. And I'm thinking as you're saying this too, that one of the main things that differentiates or is important to healthy sexuality that I think is kind of in all of this as well is really that ability to be authentic and vulnerable with another person, and actually, because having that conversation in that first example of just having consensual casual sex, all of that, there's a lot of that has to do with being open with another person and just putting it out there, that I wonder if even in the marriage example, where it's just like, well, I don't know, like we don't really know how to have this conversation, or we've had this fight so many times, and so this is the, like the rut maybe that maybe a married couple would sort of categorize that situation as, if that makes sense. Right? Like, and it's so hard to be vulnerable and authentic with another person, even at the best of times without sex involved. And so I don't know, like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, sex is kind of a whole nother level of vulnerability. We already struggle, like you're saying, to have vulnerable discussions about our emotions, about our relationship, about things that complaints we may have within the relationship. Then sexuality is a whole nother level, usually for people to be able to talk about. So imagine if we already have problems talking about just basic things, it's going to be that much harder in the sexual field. None of us have really been given the narratives or the scripts to be able to know how to do that. If you think about even like a driving metaphor, most of us, saw our parents driving a car before we drove a car. Most of us rode in a car before we drove a car. Most of us have had some experience of what that's going to be like before we even take the wheel ourselves. But most of us have not seen our parents have healthy discussions around navigating their sexuality, nor is that necessarily appropriate, right? I'm not saying that people should be having in-depth conversations about their sexuality in front of their kids, but I'm just saying, not only are we not having in-depth conversations, we're barely even discussing the topic at all. And when you have couples where there's a lot of sexual toxicity between them, kids will pick up on certain things, like mom flinches when dad touches her, right? Or dad is kind of aloof when mom comes in for some affection, or things of that nature. Kids pick up on that, and that is part of their sexual education. And so we start learning avoidant techniques, long before we start our own relationships. And then on top of that, I think sexuality is very much tied to our ego, because again, so much of what we talk about in the culture is being a good lover. If you're a man, you're supposed to be studly and have lots of experiences and be able to turn your woman on and have her, have an orgasm and push all the right buttons. And if you're a woman, you've been given, these messages of you're the sexual object and you're supposed to be, the apple of his eye and capture his complete and entire erotic template. And so there's so much pressure there that if there's a complaint, like, maybe I'd like it if you touched me a little bit differently, or maybe I'd like a different position, or maybe I'm not in the mood tonight. These things can feel tremendously wounding and rejecting in ways that maybe saying, I'm not in the mood for pizza tonight, can we do Chinese instead, is not as wounding.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I think that there's so much there that's just so awesome. So, and I think in that sense, part of it is just learning, in any relationship in general, is just really learning. I do some work with couples as well, and a lot of it is just learning to listen to each other and to be open to each other's feedback and be receptive, whether that's, in a relationship. And that's going to carry into the bedroom too, right? And into the sexual relationship as well.
Yeah, most of us will say that we want honesty, and honesty is one of the principles. And yet when our partners take risks and are honest with us, oftentimes either because of the disgust factor or the fear factor, we often go running for the hills, So if there's something that turns you on that I'm uncomfortable with, or if I realize that you're into something I'm not, or if you have a fantasy that doesn't include me, these are the types, just a few very small examples of the types of things that I have a hard time tolerating your honesty about. Yeah. And so now we get into differentiation skills, which is that idea of, can we stay connected in spite of our differences? And again, with sexuality, we've all been kind of given this narrative where, my sexuality really belongs to my committed partner, and their sexuality belongs to me. So it becomes very controlling, and anything that I'm not comfortable with becomes something that you shouldn't be doing, or that shouldn't be turning you on, And so we get into these more of power dynamics and monitoring types of behaviors of each other instead of really being curious and sitting with the discomfort of recognizing that my partner's erotic template and preferences are probably quite different from mine, or at least have some variety that's different from mine. And if we can't find spaces to talk about that, then all of that doesn't just disappear. It just goes underground.
Mm-hmm. And what I hear kind of with that too is a certain level of sort of what you're almost promoting is a little element of curiosity can go a long way in a sexual relationship. Is just oh, that's interesting to you, or that's, you know, that turns you on, like tell me about that, like what is it about that, or like, you know, just kind of being more open and curious about your partner's preferences and what turns them on, because and being open to that, I think could do a lot of great things for your relationship.
Yeah, and I think that being curious, being non-shaming, just because your partner says something that turns them on doesn't mean you have to do it.
Right.
So don't feel this like automatic pressure, like, oh my gosh, if I don't do this one thing that is a turn on for them, then somehow I'm lacking as a partner. That's also not healthy. So either you're shaming your partner or you're shaming yourself. So either way is not good. And then the last thing I'll say about that is that there's also this kind of interesting line between what I call honesty and privacy. You know, Esther Perel talks about this a lot in regards to us needing both mystery and stability in long-term relationships, particularly. And if you know everything about your partner, if you're expecting the type of honesty where you can't even have an erotic thought without my permission or without my knowledge, right? Or you can't ever masturbate, for example, without me knowing, then all of a sudden you're owning like every single aspect of somebody else's sexuality, and the mystery gets lost. And in those types of issues, there's usually some types of desire concerns long term. So how do we, again, develop the type of differentiation skills, which is kind of like the emotional muscle, to tolerate some privacy and allow some privacy for our partner? And that doesn't mean that there's, you know, should be secrets that delve into infidelity or things like that. I'm not mentioning that at all. I'm just talking about our own ability to have our own erotic individual identity, that doesn't belong to anybody but me. And then how I get to share that with somebody is what we negotiate over a lifetime if we're deciding to be in a committed relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to kind of go along with that too, is just similar to any other, you know, I think a lot of us in general, I talk to a lot of clients about just individual, like what is their relationship with their self in general, right? Like are you kind to yourself? Are you compassionate to yourself? What I hear you saying too is that part of healthy sexuality is having that everybody has at least some relationship with themselves in some way. Like is that part of what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously we're tribal creatures, we're pack animals. So I don't necessarily like these sweeping brush statements like you need to find yourself first before you ever share yourself with somebody else. Right. I don't know how you do that. I don't know what islands there are where we all just go find ourselves individually and then prepare to share ourselves with other people.
Right. Yeah.
So we're all dependent, you know, on one another. It's very normal to feel feelings when your person who you're interested in either is kind to you or is mean to you, or, you know, and so a lot of people conflate that with codependency. And that's, I think, a term that's been used in very exaggerated ways. So it's really a balancing act. It's understanding that usually most of us need some level of relational context to have satisfying, content lives. And the partner who we're with is probably not going to be able to meet our needs 100% of the time, all the time. And so if we can kind of give it a number, you know, and not that there's a measuring stick that will measure this for you, but, you know, if I'm getting 60 to 70% of my needs met from my primary partner, that's pretty good, you know, and then I've got to figure out how to get the other 30% met through more, you know, self-soothing or other types of interests, whether those are friendships or hobbies or coping mechanisms that my partner, because there's no way my partner's always going to be able to be there for me, whether that's sexually or emotionally or whatever other way.
Yeah, awesome. No, that's great. So I guess with the little bit of time that we have left, I'm wondering if we were to kind of create a sort of, like if trying to model a good, sex positive sort of way of thinking about sexuality, and if we are, you had mentioned earlier about like sex education, like what is an actual good painting of that? I know we talked about the principles, but with all of the baggage that can come from, different cultural or religious or whatever, like things that can potentially contribute to that, how do we, like, what is a good healthy sex positive sort of model that we could follow, and how do we teach that even to the up and coming generation and kind of shed some of this baggage as we're moving forward?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I just recently started a program called Sex Talk with Natasha. So if anyone wants to look that up, sextalkwithnatasha.com, which is this idea of having an ongoing sexual journey where you really address, I think, sexual healing and sexual woundedness. I see it similarly to going to the gym or going on, deciding that I'm going to eat nutritiously in a different way. This is not something that you learn in a weekend. It's not something that you go to like a one-time retreat and learn everything you're going to learn
Yeah.
or figure everything out. I think that not only does the sexual healing journey involve education, but it involves practice, because you can have an intellectual shift and an aha moment and say, oh yeah, that's probably not the healthiest way. I've been dealing with that. It's very different to then take that into your lived experience and shift behavior that's been there for years, So to not get frustrated about that, but to see it as an ongoing kind of, just like you go to the gym and work out on a regular basis to keep your physical muscles in shape. You want to have opportunities to kind of get your sexual health in shape. And so I oftentimes start from the healing perspective, in that instead of blaming myself or blaming my partner, which is what most of us typically do, we're so angry with one another or with ourselves, that we really kind of take a step back and see the system that we all have been a part of. And I don't know of any culture or race or socioeconomic status that you come from that I couldn't find some level of sexual shaming or sexual fear or something along those lines that you come from, from your history. So it can be very helpful to look at your partner and just start off with, maybe we've been married 10 years or 30 years, and it's like, wow, when I think about those 20-year-old selves of us and everything that we were supposed to learn how to manage and all the expectations that we had around sexuality and all the messages we were given about sex, it's a miracle we're still just even talking to each other, right? Like, this is amazing. This is amazing that we survived all that. Yeah. And so I think putting some blame on the system and having some compassion for yourself and for your partner of having to navigate waters that are just so treacherous can be a really good starting place, because then we're in this healing space instead of this blaming space. And then from there, I think, you just do want to have sexual education resources. Again, I'm always offering and there's great books out there. I have a lot of homework exercises to, again, help you kind of practice the shifts that need to happen on a regular basis, and being willing to talk to your kids. I have an online course, kind of helping people do that, because again, so many of our own biases come across to our kids without us even realizing. So it's an ongoing process. I would just invite people to really prioritize their sexual health. A lot of times sex is almost seen as like this frivolous thing, this like, well, if we get to it, we get to it. Right. But it's not super important. Even our health system doesn't prioritize sexuality. But what we know through more and more research is that sexuality is such an integral part of our identities, and sexual behaviors and sexual acts are actually so helpful in so many different ways, from preventing certain types of cancers to dealing with chronic pain to helping people with stress in their lives. So when sex is going well, it is definitely an integral part of your wellness and your wellness plan. So don't just focus on carbs or no carbs or the gym. Focus on, this also being part of your your health and the type of quality of life that you want to have.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, very cool. And what I hear you saying too in all of this as well, I guess maybe the only other piece that I would add is I think that in general we could really do with a shift to not, like, I don't want to say don't take sex so seriously, but like inject a little humor into it, and like have fun. It is a pleasurable, fun experience. And I think that, when you were talking before about like looking back and thinking, holy cow, like how did we even survive this minefield? And both of us are kind of having a chuckle about that at the same time, right? And I'm like, yeah. That's absolutely the case, that, looking back and thinking, holy crap. But also like, look how far we've come, and how, how positive things can be moving forward, and kind of bringing that with humor, I think it takes the edge off, and it also injects some hope into it as well, right? I think that's really valuable.
I'm a big fan of humor, and pleasure it's so interesting how many conversations we have around sex without mentioning pleasure, including, I don't know about Canada, but here in the United States, we have huge amounts of money going federally to abstinence-based sexual education programs for our teens. And so anything that has to do with pleasure is not allowed to be even taught. It has to be reproductive. So that means that our teens are not getting education on organs such as the clitoris. They're not getting education on lubrication. They're not getting education on anal play, right? And so there's so many aspects that they ignore because they're either not reproductive aspects, or they have to do with pleasure, which we want to not let kids know it's pleasurable, because then they're going to do it more, right? But guess what? Kids are doing it anyway. And now, because they don't have the tools to really prioritize pleasure, it's amazing how often, kids are having painful sexual intercourse or painful sexual experiences, including anal sex, and nobody is really teaching them the tools that they need to have pleasurable, healthy sexual experiences that without all this moral overlay that we started talking about at the beginning.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's so important. And like, newsflash to anybody who is in, setting those standards, the internet exists, people. Like, I don't know what you're trying to stop. Like, let's get real for a minute.
And we have research to show that these programs don't work.
Yeah.
We're wasting our tax dollars.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Wow. That's I mean, far be it from policymakers to consult scientists and on stuff that they know about, though. So I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and it's that fear, right? We're afraid for our kids. Fear oftentimes comes from a well-intentioned place, and yet it's one of the most insidious ways that we can teach. And so in abusive ways. And you really can carry, we're so concerned about this small time frame where we don't want our teenagers to have sex, which is maybe a 5 to 7 year, let's say from 14 to 24, right? We don't want our kids to have sex during that time. And yet they're going to have sexual experiences probably from the age of 17 till hopefully 99, right? And so all of these messages that are geared towards these 7 years of development that are so fear and shame based lay a foundation that is so horrific for people to have to overcome when it comes to accepting sexual pleasure and getting over sexual shame, that can take decades to get over those types of foundations. Absolutely. Which is really tragic.
Absolutely. Wow. Natasha, this has been awesome. Is there anything that we haven't covered yet that we should have, or that you feel is like a really important piece here? Like, what would you add to what we've already talked about?
Well, the fact that we talked about pleasure and orgasm and clitorises always makes me happy. And I think the fact that we talked about sexual health as something to really prioritize makes me happy. And I think the only thing I would add to that is that it doesn't matter if you're in a relationship or not. A lot of people are like, oh, well, I'm single, so sex doesn't matter. It's not something I can focus on. And that's not true. We have lots of great ways to have solo sex, as well as claiming your own sexual and sensual identity as an individual. It also doesn't matter if you're gay or lesbian or transgender, or even consider yourself asexual. There's still an identity there and energy there that you have the right and you're deserving to explore and, reach, that continual idea of moving towards something better while at the same time being pretty accepting and content with where you're at, given all the experiences you've had.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that element of, with all of that. And I think a lot of people, thinking about maybe people who are listening, somebody out there might be thinking like, oh, wow, like, I've got a long ways to go. I would totally just reemphasize that element of self-compassion and, just kind of accepting where you are, and maybe like this recognition of, oh, you know what, things could get better. Like just kind of having patience with that process too. And sort of just taking whatever, being a little bit more, cutting yourself a break, I guess is kind of what I was saying, and learning to love yourself more.
You can't climb a mountain in a day. Oftentimes you can't eat an elephant in one setting. And this is why at Sex Talk with Natasha, I have daily actions and daily exercises, just little tiny little things. It doesn't take a long time to do these things, because exactly of that point, I want people to just be able to bite off a little piece that's digestible and chewable, and that leads them into that direction of forward motion that they're seeking without feeling overwhelmed or broken or hopeless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow, that's awesome. Well, Natasha, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for being on the show, on the Shift Show. Natasha Helfer Parker, where can people find you online and kind of follow what you do?
Yeah, so sextalkwithnatasha.com is, where I direct you. I also my regular website is natashaparker.org. So I have lots of different projects. I work with a lot of religiously conservative people. So some of my projects have to do with those types of populations. But I just love talking about sex. I love that you had me on. I have so enjoyed our collegial relationship over the years, Zac. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Shift Show. Be sure to check out our website, shiftpsych.com, for more great content to help you optimize your life. Follow us on social media at ShiftPsych, and let us know if you have ideas or things you'd really like to hear about on the podcast. If you found this useful or interesting, which you probably did since you're still here, please share and review the show. And make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. This lets us know that you like what you hear, so we can bring you more of it. The podcast was brought to you by Shift Psych's results-driven mind trainers. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on The Shift Show.